6 o'clock, so I'll call the meeting to order, or I'll try to call the meeting to order. First item of business is adoption of the agenda. Do I have a mover? Deputy Mayor.
Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Stewart, that the agenda be adopted as printed and circulated.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Having adopted the agenda, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof? Not seeing any. Minutes. Do I have a mover? Deputy Mayor.
Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Stewart, that the minutes from the March 5th, 2025 council meeting be adopted as printed and circulated.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. So, we have 3 planning applications up now at 6. Do I have a resolution to go into a public meeting and sit as Committee of Adjustment? Deputy Mayor.
Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Stewart, that the council meeting be adjourned at 6:01 p.m. for the purpose of holding a public meeting pursuant to the provisions of the Planning Act, and that council move into the Committee of Adjustment for the purpose of hearing minor variance applications.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And Spencer, I will turn the entire process of all 3 of these minor variances over to you. Here we go.
Thank you, Mayor Ryan. Good evening to council, staff, and members of the public joining us here this evening. The first application for minor variance is AO2-25, and it affects lands on Road 84 in the village of Kintore. And in this case, the property is within the township's general industrial zone, so it is one of a few general industrial parcels within the village, shown on the screen there before the committee at this time. And the applicant initially had applied to amend an existing site plan for this property to facilitate the construction of an addition to an existing warehouse building that's located on the east side of the property. Upon review of that site plan, it was identified by building staff that minor variance would be required as the existing building is considered legal nonconforming. The issue with the existing building is that it's too close to the easterly property line. So the applicant is applying for this variance in order to further receive approval for a site plan, which is in process currently. The application, the notice itself did refer to 1 meter setback, or upon further review of the detailed design drawings provided by the applicant's engineer, it did come to light that there's about 2.5 meters separation between the neighboring property and the existing warehouse building. So that is reflected in the requested variance and the recommended variance for the committee's attention. As a result of circulation, there were no comments received from agencies or neighboring residents that warranted any additional discussion in the report. Staff are generally supportive of the application here tonight. The primary factor that we look at for these areas of relief when it comes to interior side yard relief is just that there's sufficient room for drainage and access and ongoing maintenance. If somebody has to put a ladder against the building, for example, they're able to do that without encroaching onto a neighboring property. Staff are supportive of the application here tonight. I'm available to take any questions, and the applicant is also available to do the same.
Thank you. Questions for the planner on the report from council? Councillor.
2 questions, Spencer. One is a phrase that I'm not familiar with that's in the report under agency review, where the fire chief quoted that that part of the building permit process confirmation of limiting distance will be assessed to the satisfaction of the township. What does that mean?
Through the chair to Committee Member Mitchell's question, the limiting distance, as the chief referred to, is something in the Ontario Building Code, and it really looks at the separation between the building itself that's being proposed and neighboring properties or neighboring buildings, and it really assesses the level of combustibility of a building. So in some instances, there may be a 2-hour firewall or otherwise as appropriate and as required by the building code. So the fire chief in this case was just flagging that to make sure that our building staff, prior to issuing the permits, are looking at that closely, because there is a very minimal distance between the building and neighboring properties.
Thanks for clarifying that. My other question is, This addition is for warehousing, but there's also light industrial usage on this site. So what's the process as far as a site plan or amendment if the usage of the property were to change in some way?
Through the chair to the question, generally speaking, provided it's continues to be a permitted use within the general industrial zone, and it's within the existing buildings or the buildings that are approved on the site plan, there will not be a requirement to do a further site plan amendment. That would be triggered if the applicant later comes and deviates from their site plan and says, I now want to do a third building, or I want to introduce a different use or modify the parking or drainage or grading or lighting. Any of those details, staff have the ability to look at that and say this is now a deviation from what's approved on the site plan and therefore requires an amendment.
I appreciate that because, as I said, we're looking at warehousing, but there also is another usage there that potentially could change over time. So thank you.
Any other questions from council for the planner? Is the applicant here and do they wish to speak to their application? Are there any members of the public here who wish to speak to the application? All right. Do I have a motion? Deputy Mayor.
Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Stewart, that the Township of Zorra Committee of Adjustment approve application AO2-25 submitted by 2782946 Ontario Inc. for lands described as South Part Lot 16, Concession 10, East Nizuri, municipally known as 842967 Road 84 in the Township of Zorra, as it relates to relief from Section 18.2, Table 18.2 zone provisions to reduce the minimum required interior side yard width from 15 meters, 49.2 feet, to 2.5 meters, 8.2 feet, to facilitate a building addition onto an existing warehousing building on a property zoned general industrial zone, MG, in the Township of Zorra, subject to the following condition: that the relief granted by the committee regarding application AO2-25 shall apply to building addition with a size and of an approximate location as illustrated on Plate 3 of report number 2025-88 to the satisfaction of the Township of Zorra.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. So that's approved. So you just got to follow up with CBO Mike Hughes, and he'll make sure that you follow the right process from here on in. Okay? Thank you. All right. Spencer, next.
Thank you. The second application for minor variance tonight is AO3-25, and this affects lands at 125 St. Andrew Street in the village of Embro. In this case, the applicant is seeking relief of two provisions from the township zoning bylaw, both as they relate to yard depth. So the first being the interior side yard depth and the second being the front yard depth. In this case, the applicant is looking at building an attached garage onto the existing single detached dwelling that's on the site. And the relief is necessitated really just given the proposed layout of the attached garage that the applicant is seeking. It's a small dwelling that exists on the house, and there's not a whole lot of different locations for this structure to accommodate the applicant's needs. So as such, they are seeking that front yard relief. I would note that staff looked at this, and really the 10 meters that's contained in the township zoning bylaw is frankly somewhat of an outdated provision. However, in our smaller villages, we do look to ensure that there's adequate room for off-street parking so that people are actually able to accommodate their vehicles on the lot. In this case, both building and planning staff are satisfied that going from the 10 meters down to 7 meters is sufficient and reasonable to continue to function to park vehicles off-street. With respect to the interior side yard width, as was mentioned to committee with the previous application, we look to ensure that there's adequate room that will remain for drainage. I would just flag that in discussions with the building department, 2 feet is essentially the absolute minimum that the building department is willing to accept. In this case, the building department is satisfied with going down to that minimal distance. As a result of circulation, we did not hear any comments from neighboring residents, no comments from agency staff that warrant discussion in the report. We are supportive of the application tonight. I'm happy to take any questions, and the applicant is also available.
Thank you. Questions from the committee for the planner? Not seeing any. Does the applicant wish to speak to their application? No, thanks. Are there any members of the public here who wish to speak to the application? Not seeing any. Do I have a mover? Deputy Mayor.
Moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Stewart, that the Township of Zorra Committee of Adjustment approve application AO3-25 submitted by Mitch Valmerschazen. My apologies. Did I? It's easier when it's like Ontario and some numbers. Mitch Valmerschazen. For lands described as Plan 39, North Part Lot 10, and municipally known as 125 St. Andrew Street, Embro, in the Township of Zorra, as it relates to relief from Section 11.1, Table 11.2, R1 Zone Provisions 2, reduce the minimum required interior side yard width from 1.5 meters, 4.92 feet, to 0.6 meters, 2 feet, and reduce the minimum required front yard depth from 10 meters, 32.8 feet, to 7 meters, 23 feet, to facilitate the construction of an attached garage, subject to the following condition, that the relief granted by the committee regarding application AO3-25 shall apply to a garage comprising approximately 66 meters squared, which is 707 feet squared, and at an approximate location as illustrated on Plate 3 of Report Number 2025-89 to the satisfaction of the Township of Zorra.
Anybody want that read again? No? Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And Spencer, next.
Thank you. The final application for a minor variance tonight, AO4-25, affects a property on Road 84. In this case, the applicant is requesting 2 areas of relief. Their property is within the village zone in the village of Kintore. And in this case, they had an existing detached accessory structure which was lost due to a fire in 2024. And they are applying to reestablish a similar structure in a similar footprint. However, it's not identical. That is, the information regarding that is contained in the report for the committee's consideration. However, the one item I will highlight in this case is the applicant did have a desire to be close to Road 84. I believe 5.5 meters was initially requested for the front yard depth. In discussions with the building department, staff were not satisfied with 5.5 meters. The applicant did agree to revise that to the 7 meters as being the minimum. And that's really just, it's illustrated on Plate 3 for the committee, or Plate 4 rather, and it's really just to highlight the fact that we have these provisions for a reason, and in this case, front yard depth is put in place to ensure that we have adequate room for off-street parking. We do know that now more than ever there are larger vehicles that people have as their personal vehicles, so we just look to ensure that they're wholly contained on the property and that there's no overhang onto municipal infrastructure such as sidewalks in this case. The applicant has agreed to that modified relief, and that's reflected in the report. There's also an area of relief relative to the maximum permitted height. Excuse me. I would note rather that there are 2 dimensions contained in the report. One refers to 5.5 meters, one refers to 5.6 meters. Based on the actual drawing that will be submitted for the building permit, it is a midpoint height of 5.54 meters, 18.2 feet. I would recommend that should the committee approve this application, they refer to 5.6 meters to give that minimal wiggle room based on the drawing that's before the committee tonight. As a result of circulation, I did receive 1 phone call from a neighboring resident, and they called to express their support for their neighbor's application. So they just wanted to make sure that the committee was aware of that, as they were unable to attend tonight. So they wanted to express their support for the application. There were no other comments received as part of agency circulation or otherwise that warrant additional discussion or anything in the report itself. Staff are satisfied that this represents good planning and is minor in nature, and we are therefore happy to recommend approval of the application and also happy to take any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you. Questions from the committee for the planner? Does the applicant wish to speak to their application? Are there any members of the public here who wish to speak to the application? Councillor Stewart.
Moved by Stewart, seconded by Gregg, that the Township of Zorra Committee of Adjustment approve application A04-25 submitted by Brian and Jacqueline Van Dale for lands described as Lot 16, Concession 10, East Missouri, municipally known as 842969 Road 84 in the Township of Zorra, as it relates to relief from Section 5.1, Table 5.1.1.3, regulations for accessory uses, to increase the maximum permitted gross floor area from 100 meters squared to 117 meters squared, increase the maximum permitted height from 4.0 meters to 5.6 meters, and 2, relief from Section 14.2, Table 14.2 zone provisions to reduce the minimum required interior side yard width from 1.5 meters to 0.9 meters, and reduce the minimum required front yard depth from 10 meters to 7 meters to facilitate the construction of a new replacement garage on the subject lands, subject to the following condition: that the relief granted by the committee regarding application A04-25 shall apply to a garage comprising approximately 117 square meters and at an approximate location as illustrated on Plate 3 of report number 2025-90 to the satisfaction of the Township of Zorra.
Is there any discussion? Councillor Mitchell.
I support the application. As Spencer noted in the report, that this was replacing an older garage that burnt not too long ago. And there's the picture of that garage included in our report, which shows that it was not that aesthetically pleasing, and that the building that's going to replace it will be much better for just the look of the neighborhood, and I applaud the landowner for doing so. And I think it's interesting, there's not a whole lot of building activity that goes in the town of Kintore, and to have two minor variances back to back, is things are booming in our part of the town.
On a per property basis, it's probably the most active village in the entire county right now. Any other discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. So again, follow up with Mike. He'll make sure you're on the right side of timing and everything to get you your permits and everything, and you're good to go then, okay? All right. And do I have a motion to come out of Committee of Adjustment?
Moved by Stewart, seconded by Gregg, that council move out of the Committee of Adjustment and pursuant to the Planning Act, that the public meeting be adjourned at 6:18 p.m. and the regular meeting of council be called back to order.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And we have no delegations. Next report is from Corporate and Protective Services Department, 9.3 Financial Services, Report 2025-032 from the Manager of Financial Services regarding an update to the purchasing policy. Manager Grogan, is there anything you want to highlight for council before I ask them for questions?
No, not at this time.
Questions from council on the report? Councillor Mitchell.
I have 4 questions for you, Kim, and first of all, thanks for getting this report back to us relatively quickly after the motion was passed a couple of meetings ago. First question is, I was surprised to see that we have 3,533 suppliers. So how far back in our history did you go to come up with that number?
So our current financial software system goes back to 1999. So that's how far back our vendor listing goes. And out of those suppliers, there were only 6 that actually have a U.S. address. So very few vendors that we deal with directly from outside of Canada.
Okay, so that answers the gist of the question of the motion, what the impact of the tariffs are. Second question is, I'd never seen the chart or the information about the trade agreement thresholds. And what real impact do they have on our purchasing decisions to meet those guidelines that, or rules that are listed there?
Thank you. So municipalities in Ontario are required to follow the components that are included in each and every trade agreement. It is interesting when you're actually compiling a listing to see how many trade agreements are actually in effect for us to comply to. Those trade agreements basically provide us with direction in regards to any open procurement activities that we undertake to ensure that we're making procurement available to our trading partners. So while the municipality, and looking at our vendors and the number of vendors that we deal with in the US, while the municipality historically has not necessarily been impacted by those trade agreements, as far as our open procurement is concerned, we still having open competition thresholds lower than the lowest threshold that's identified in those trade agreements still opens the door for activity kind of outside of what those thresholds. So there's a gap between what our policy allows as far as flexibility goes, because outside of that open competition procurement, we have more ability to invite bidders and to invite suppliers to bid and submit quotations for our projects, which kind of keeps things to a Canada focus and a local focus.
And a couple of questions on the purchasing policy itself. And under the recommendations for changes to 2.2.1 and 2.3 of the policy, it increases the upper limits to 100,000 from 30,000. I believe that can be done by a department head without going to council. Am I right on that?
That is correct.
Yeah. So that's a significant increase. What's the rationale of more than tripling that limit?
So just to clarify, the intent of increasing that open competition threshold from 30,000 to 100 doesn't change the department head or director's responsibility to remain within our budget constraints as set by council. Effectively, by increasing from the 30 to the 100, it just means that we're not required to go to an open competition, open bidding scenario until we reach that 100,000. The 100,000 was selected in order to align our policy with the lowest legislated threshold in all of our regulated trade agreements, which will provide staff and the municipality with the greatest flexibility in selecting suppliers and closing that gap.
Okay. And my last question is, we've recently changed the township senior management structure. So does the definition of department head in the policy needs update? Does it need updating, or is it okay?
So you are absolutely correct. The intent is for the policy to be reviewed in its entirety before the end of 2025 and to have it brought back to council for review. The trade agreement reference omissions that are not in our policy right now, as well as additional items and housekeeping items, will be brought forward to council for that full comprehensive review. The intent of the update before you was in response to the resolution that was passed by council on February 5th, and staff wanted to make sure that we were able to respond in a more timely fashion than going through the entire comprehensive review of the policy at this point.
So the reason for the last question was, in light of that we're raising that threshold, I wanted to make sure there was no gray area who actually had the authority to make that decision. So I appreciate you fleshing out the information that was in the report. Certainly stuff that I hadn't seen before, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other questions? I have a mover. Councillor Stewart.
Moved by Stewart, seconded by Grigg, that council approve the amendments to purchasing policy 500-05 as identified in report 2025-032.
Is there any discussion? Councillor Mitchell.
As I said a moment ago, thanks to staff for bringing this report. I think the intent was just to take a look at the impact of the tariffs could possibly have on the cost of our purchasing, and if there's some way that we could maybe save some money or send a signal or a combination of the two. As it turns out, as you said, there was very few vendors that are directly U.S., although with our combined economies, there's a lot of things that are variations of U.S. and Canada, so I appreciate the information.
Anyone else? I'm happy with this. I think, you know, I would love to be able to say, don't buy American. But the world is simply not that simple. I think that's one of the problems right now. Some people are trying to make things simpler than they actually are, and that's causing a lot of problems. But I think this gives us the, you know, our staff the most ability to do that we legally can do, which is important to stay on the right side of the law. And I'm comfortable that I was at a Western Ontario Wardens Caucus March 7th, and Western Ontario Wardens are working with the provincial government and the federal government to try and figure out are there tools that the province and more likely the federal government can give municipalities to do these things. But until they do, the law is the law. And I think this report, you know, moves us as far as we can move towards what we might want to do, staying on the right side of the law. So I think this is the right way to go forward. Very happy, especially that it came back so fast. Any other discussion before I call the question? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And boards and committees, two separate resolutions here. Do I have one for A? Councillor Stewart.
Moved by Stewart, seconded by Grigg, that item 11A be received and filed for information purposes only.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And 11B, do I have a mover for that one? Councillor Stewart.
Moved by Stewart, seconded by Grigg, that item 11B be received and filed for information purposes only.
Is there any discussion? Deputy Mayor.
I just wanted to provide a little bit of brief context. The correspondence from ZMCC is very long, with a lot of moving pieces. It was in relation to ongoing updates around a project that has had a lot of different changes over time as it's been cooked up, and until it's complete its construction, there will be additional changes to come. What they were looking to identify is that as staff are exploring through the co-build project opportunities to leverage the best for both projects, that the timeline of completing the construction, it's important to them that it not be pushed off for too many years down the road. And so this was sort of the intention of this motion. It was not in relation to a specific decision that had been made yet, but in relation to the update that was provided to the committee at the time. Because this is in relation to ongoing conversations, I'm aware that there's already some things that are still shifting and moving with this. So my understanding is that staff will be bringing, as a result of the RFP process, staff will be bringing that information forward to council. And at that time, then we can have a look at that, hear the recommendations from staff and move forward. This is really just the opportunity that the committee had in relation to the update at that time to voice their interest in the timeline of completion of the project still being on the radar of council and staff.
Anyone else? I'm happy to have this correspondence. I think it's good. We're going to get a report, as he said, from staff on what the RFP responses are and possible prioritized recommendations or options for council. And now we have this lens to look at it. We have an idea of where the committee is coming at this from, and that'll inform our deliberation when we get that report. So I'm happy that they give us this correspondence. Anybody else before I call the question? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And 12, information items. Do I have a mover for either one or both of those?
Moved by Councillor Mitchell, seconded by Councillor Finch, that items 12A and B be received and filed for information purposes only.
Is there any discussion? Councilor
Quick
Mitchell.
comment on A, which has to do with the removal of load restrictions, and one of the roads listed is Oxford Road 16, which runs from Kintor over to the Embro Side Road. And I'm glad to see that with all the work that's been done on that road and brought it up to a higher standard, that will be available for truckers to use and less likely for them to go down one of our roads that is half load. So it makes life easier for the trucking community and easier for our road maintenance community possibly. So glad to see that.
Anyone else? Did I even get a motion on that? You did? Okay, sorry. Any other discussion? All's in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And then calendar, I think. Councillor Finch.
April 5th, the Caledonian Society is having a pub night at the Embro Legion with live entertainment at 7 p.m. And April 11th and 12th, Sherry Garner is doing her I Am Enough talk theater, 7 p.m., 2 p.m., and 7 p.m. again at the Thistle Theater in Embro.
Anyone else? Councillor Mitchell.
Last evening, I represented the Township of Zorra at Perth South Council meeting, sitting on a court of revision to do with the municipal drain work in Perth South, in the area of James Street South coming out of St. Mary's. The reason I was there was a large part of the land that's impacted by this work is on the south side of Highway number 7 in Zorra Township. Every other court of revision I've been to was 5 to 10 minutes maximum. This one, there were 2 objections from landowners having to do with the upgrade of a large culvert going under James Street. They objected to how much they were being assessed. So this court of revision was an hour and a quarter, in which I was huddled with the deputy mayor and one of the councillors from South Perth in the CAO's office. And what we did was the section that had to do with the assessment for the culvert, we reassessed the numbers of how much each of, I think there was 7 or 8 different landowners were being assessed, and we presented that back to the council. It has no impact on Zorra Township because they had split the job up into different sections, so the assessment for Zorra Township residents does not change at all. But because there was a change in the assessment, that means that the process continues. Those numbers have to go out to those ones that are being reassessed, which means that I have the opportunity to go back to another South Perth Council meeting in a month's time, and hopefully it is a 5-minute process at that point. Because I'm on the court of revision, I have to be there to follow through to the conclusion of it. So I don't know if that's community interest, but I found it interesting.
Anyone else? Okay. Motion to go into closed.
Moved by Councillor Mitchell, seconded by Councillor Finch. The council move into closed meeting session at 6:33 p.m. pursuant to section 239.2C and a proposed or pending acquisition or disposition of land by the municipality or board, and 239.2B, personal matters about an identifiable individual, including municipal or local board employees.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. All right, we are back from closed, and the next item of business is a motion to deal with closed. Councillor Finch.
Moved by Councillor Finch, seconded by Councillor Mitchell, that council directs staff to proceed with the service of Colstar Environmental to begin environmental remediation of 8 Commissioner Street as soon as possible with the cost to be funded from reserves, and that any potential future profit received from said lands be placed in reserves to be used for any property-related expenses, and that the Township Roads Department investigate the potential use of any assets on the property for township purposes.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And confirmatory and adjournment, we agree? Yeah. Motion to confirmatory motion? Councillor Mitchell?
Moved by Councillor Mitchell, seconded by Councillor Finch, that bylaw 10-25, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of council held March 19th, 2025, be read a first, second, and third time this March 19th, 2025, and further that the mayor and clerk are hereby authorized to sign the name and affix the corporate seal thereto.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And a motion to adjourn?
Moved by Councillor Mitchell, seconded by Councillor Finch, that this session of council now be adjourned and herewith closed at 8:09 p.m. and the next meeting of council be called for the April 2nd, 2025 at 9:30 a.m. in the council chambers at the Zorra Municipal Center.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. And we are adjourned.